Communion in manifest grave sin. I was ordered by my pastor to give communion to same-sex married couples. As I'm under authority of my pastor and bishop by vows, I felt forced to comply. But I'm no longer going to distribute the Eucharist. What should I do? Well, this is an interesting and somewhat difficult question to answer. And so I wanted to do two things. The first one is to talk about the idea of authority in denying communion in general, and then speak specifically to this situation. So first, the idea of refusing communion in general. I've spoken about this a few times in the past. The question here comes to Canon 9:15 of refusing communion to those who are obstinately continuing in manifest grave sin. And so I think there's another video which I can go more in depth into this. But in this particular question, I chose to answer this one because I think it goes into this idea of what does it mean to be in a church. In a previous video, I've spoken about this idea of spiritual chaos. And the church is not in favor of spiritual anarchy. The church is very much so focused in on order and responsibility, who gets to make decisions and things like this. And so in the Canon 9:15, we come to this sort of difficult question of, well, who gets to make the decision about what constitutes manifest grave sin or continuing in manifest grave sin? Benedict XVI, in one of his letters, spoke about couples that were divorced and remarried, and he said that it was the responsibility of the individual pastor to be the one to use Canon 9:15 or not. And then also, obviously, that the bishop is the one that would choose to do this. So in its core, the one that gets to make the decision for these things are those that have care of souls. And there's a lot of reason for this. Like, it makes a lot of sense. You don't want just random people deciding, well, you're not going to receive communion because I think you're in manifest grave sin, when they might not know the circumstances, they might not know the situation. We don't just want a whole bunch of rogue people going off and doing whatever they feel like. The church is not in the business of anarchy. And so the responsibility has been given to those that have care of souls, pastor, bishop. Now, hopefully the pastor and the bishop are doing what they ought to do. Hopefully they are looking at this situation, that they're actually doing interviews, discussions, trying to get to the root of what's going on. Perhaps in this sort of situation, I don't know the circumstances, but an idea that might take place. Perhaps there's been a conversion experience that has taken place, that these two people are willing to live as siblings, and that the pastor has deemed it that it's not going to cause scandal if they receive communion. That would be an example of perhaps the individual might not know what's going on, and the person that has care of souls would know. So that would be one possible thing. But the overarching idea here is that the person that makes the decision, the one that acts as the judge, is the one that has care of souls, the pastor or the bishop. Now, I heard it once said, and I think this makes sense and it's true. When you are an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, or when you're an ordinary minister of Holy Communion, at that time, at the moment of distribution of communion, you are not acting as judge, but as minister. That there is a time when there will be a judgment made, that judgment is made outside of the moment of giving communion. And so that would be kind of where I would go with this. If a person is struggling with this, ask the pastor is the one that makes the decision. But in that moment, you're acting not as judge, but as minister. Now, also, this comes with a major asterisk. As extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, or as any minister of communion, you do have a responsibility to ensure that the Eucharist is treated with love and reverence. So if a person, for example, comes forward with this like an obscene t-shirt that denies the Christian faith in some way, or something that is blasphemous, or very obviously is protesting against the Catholic Church, you would have a responsibility to ensure that the Eucharist is treated with love, reverence, and respect. So in a situation like that, a sort of an extreme situation, that one would make sense to deny communion at this time, because there's fear that the Eucharist might be desecrated or something along those lines. But in general, apart from the sort of extreme situations, it is the responsibility of the pastor, the bishop, the one that has care of souls, to make the determination whether or not Canon 9:15 applies, and that the individual who is distributing communion at that time is to look to them to make the decision. So that's the first question. Second part of the question, what do you do? Well, this comes into another very difficult thing of cooperation with evil, for example. Let's say that, say for example here, that Canon 9:15 should be implemented, that this is causing scandal, that this is manifest grave sin. Let's assume all of those things. Well, ultimately the decision is the pastor's. The pastor is the one that gets to make that decision, or the pastor or bishop. And so they're the ones that make the decision. They're the ones that are choosing to ignore the Code of Canon Law in the case situation that I've just described. And so you would then be cooperating. So in this case, it would seem as though it would be remote because you're not the one making the decision, you're apart from it, you're acting as minister in this moment. So it would seem as though it was remote. However, the principle of cooperation does not tell you what is morally excellent, it only tells you what is morally permissible. And so I would say this would be something for you to contemplate on yourself. It says that in the question, it said that you have chosen not to distribute communion. That is an option. An extraordinary minister of Holy Communion is just that, extraordinary. It's beyond the ordinary. And so you're under no obligation to actually fulfill that ministry. And so you could leave that at any time. That makes perfect sense. Your responsibility to talk with, have the discussion with your pastor, that one would be a matter of individual discernment, whether or not you should talk with them. I believe that's Canon 2:12, which says that the individual has a right and even an obligation to have a dialogue and conversation with their pastor. And so that might be something to think about as well. But also focus in on where you feel called in this moment. Do you feel called that, okay, I should step back from this ministry because you don't agree with what's going on? Okay, that's perfectly legitimate. Or to discuss things with pastor, again, perfectly legitimate. Because again, maybe he knows things that aren't going on, and maybe he might just simply say, there are things that you don't know that's going on, and then leave it at that. So that might be the practical things that I would recommend to you in this situation, and hopefully that's helpful.